step into the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, where a shocking mystery unfolds. Renowned fashion designer Madame Celeste vanishes on the eve of her grand London fashion gala, leaving behind an overturned chair, a half-stitched gown, and a trail of secrets. Was it her nervous assistant Clara, hiding a guilty truth? The ambitious model Isabella swayed by secret letters? The powerful sponsor, Lord Ashford, with his shadowy motives? Or the envious rival, Elise Dubois, driven to desperate measures? Join Miss Jane Marple with her keen eye and quiet wisdom as she unravels a web of envy, betrayal, and ambition to reveal the truth in this gripping Agatha Christie-style tale. Chapter 1. The Empty Atelier. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the village's cobbled lanes. In the heart of this tranquil hamlet, where gossip was as common as tea in bone china cups, an extraordinary event had stirred the air. Madame Celeste, a fashion designer whose name was whispered with reverence in London's haute couture circles, had taken up temporary residence in Rose Cottage, a quaint dwelling with ivy-clad walls. Her purpose was singular: to prepare her latest collection for the London Fashion Gala, an event that promised to cement her reputation as a visionary. Yet, on this particular morning, the village awoke to a mystery as delicate and perplexing as the silks in her atelier. Miss Jane Marple, whose unassuming presence belied a mind as sharp as her knitting needles, sat in her garden at Danemid Cottage. Her hands moved rhythmically, the soft click of needles punctuating the stillness as she worked on a pale blue shawl. From her vantage point, she could see the comings and goings at Rose Cottage, a mere stone's throw across the lane. She had noted the flurry of activity in recent weeks: delivery vans bearing bolts of fabric, the occasional glimpse of Madame Celeste's elegant figure, and the anxious bustle of her assistant, Clara Wren. But this morning, an unnatural quiet hung over the cottage, broken only by a sudden cry that drew Miss Marple's attention. Clara Wren, a slight young woman with a pinched face and nervous hands, had burst from the cottage, her apron askew. She hurried to the village post office, where Mrs. Bantry, the vicar's wife, was collecting her letters. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of village life, learned of the commotion through her maid, Cherry, who had a knack for gathering news. "Miss Wren says Madame Celeste is gone," Cherry reported, her eyes wide. "Vanished like a ghost. The atelier's in a state. Chair tipped over, a gown half-stitched on the mannequin, but not a sign of her." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mild blue eyes narrowing. She recalled a similar incident years ago, when a young curate had disappeared, only to be found hiding in a hayloft after a misunderstanding. But Madame Celeste, a woman of poise and purpose, was unlikely to flee without cause. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, setting her knitting aside. She donned her straw hat and made her way to Rose Cottage, ostensibly to offer Clara a jar of her homemade damson jam, but, in truth, to observe. The atelier, a converted barn adjacent to the cottage, was a scene of ordered chaos. Bolts of shimmering silk and chiffon lay neatly stacked, yet the air held a sense of disruption. A single wooden chair lay on its side, its carved back splintered as if struck in haste. On the central mannequin, a half-finished gown of sapphire taffeta gleamed, its hem trailing threads like unfinished thoughts. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting the open window, its latch unfastened, and a faint smudge of dirt on the sill. Clara, hovering near the door, wrung her hands. "She was here last night, Miss Marple," she stammered. "Working late, as always. I left at 10, and now she's gone." Miss Marple offered a sympathetic smile, her mind already tracing possibilities. "Dear me, how distressing," she said, her tone soothing but her eyes sharp. "And no note, no message?" Clara shook her head, her lips trembling. Miss Marple patted her arm, noting the girl's pallor and the way her fingers clutched a scrap of lace. Fear, she thought, or perhaps something more. She recalled a village girl who had once concealed a theft behind such nervous gestures. As she left the atelier, Miss Marple glanced back at the cottage, its roses nodding in the breeze. The disappearance of Madame Celeste was no mere whim, she decided. It bore the hallmarks of intent, perhaps malice. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as common as sparrows, Miss Marple knew that human nature would reveal its truths in time. She returned to her garden, her needles resuming their steady rhythm, but her thoughts were already stitching together the threads of a mystery that promised to unravel in ways no one could foresee. Chapter 2. The cast of suspects. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its tidy cottages and gossip-laden tea parties, was no stranger to small dramas, but the disappearance of Madame Celeste had ignited a fire of speculation that even the most seasoned busybodies found hard to quench. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage drawing-room, sipped her tea with the air of one who listened more than she spoke. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Bantry, had invited her to discuss the parish flower show, but the conversation, as was inevitable, had turned to the mystery at Rose Cottage. The room, with its chintz curtains and slightly faded elegance, hummed with the voices of the village's most inquisitive, each eager to offer a theory on the vanished designer. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed with the thrill of scandal, leaned forward. "It's quite extraordinary, Jane," she said, her voice low but vibrant. "Madame Celeste, gone without a trace. Clara Wren was at the post office this morning, looking as if she'd seen a ghost. And that atelier, such a mess, they say, with a chair overturned and all. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, though her expression remained placid. "It is most unsettling," she replied, setting her teacup down with care. "But I find, in such cases, that one must look to those closest to the missing person. People, you know, are rarely what they seem." Her tone was gentle, but her mind was already threading through the possibilities, much like the wool she wound for her knitting. Mrs. Bantry, never one to miss a cue, launched into a detailed account of the 4 individuals known to have been in Madame Celeste's orbit. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as the vicar's wife painted a vivid picture of the suspects. Each, in their way, was a figure of interest, their motives tangled like the intricate patterns of Celeste's designs. As Mrs. Bantry spoke, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to similar cases in St. Mary Mead, a pilfered silver spoon, a missing curate, where the truth had lain hidden in the ordinary details of human behaviour. The first suspect was Clara Wren, Madame Celeste's assistant. A young woman of 25, Clara was a study in contrasts. Her delicate hands were skilled at embroidery, capable of transforming Celeste's sketches into wearable art. Yet her demeanour was one of perpetual unease. Mrs. Bantry described her as mousy, with a tendency to startle at sudden noises and a habit of avoiding direct eye contact. "She's been with Celeste for 2 years," Mrs. Bantry said, "and they say she's devoted, but there's something odd about her. Always lurking about, as if she's hiding something. And she was the last to see Celeste, wasn't she? Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She had observed Clara that morning, her pale face and trembling fingers suggesting more than mere distress. Devotion, Miss Marple knew, could mask other sentiments, guilt, fear, or even resentment. She recalled a village girl, years ago, who had seemed loyal to her employer, but had been pilfering from the till to fund a secret romance. Clara's nervousness, she mused, might stem from loyalty, stretched to its breaking point, or a secret she dared not share. Next was Isabella Voss, the model chosen to showcase Celeste's collection at the London Fashion Gala. At 22, Isabella was a vision of modern beauty, with high cheekbones, raven hair, and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken ambitions. She had arrived in St. Mary Mead a month ago, staying at the Blue Boar Inn, where her presence drew admiring glances and whispered envy. "She's quite the star," Mrs. Bantry said, a touch of disapproval in her voice. "Always posing, always charming the men. But I heard from Mrs. Price at the inn that Isabella's been getting letters. Fancy ones sealed with wax. Could be from a rival designer, don't you think?" Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Ambition, she knew, was a powerful motivator. Isabella's beauty was her currency, but her loyalty to Celeste might waver if a better offer came her way. Miss Marple thought of a young actress in the village amateur dramatics, whose sudden defection to a rival troupe had caused quite a stir. Isabella, with her youth and allure, might be tempted by promises of fame or fortune, but would she stoop to betrayal, or worse? The third suspect was Lord Reginald Ashford, a man whose wealth and influence cast a long shadow over the village. A patron of the arts, he had bankrolled Celeste's collection, his investment ensuring the gala would be a spectacle. At 50, Lord Ashford was handsome in a stern way, with a reputation for ruthlessness in business. "He's been ever so generous," Mrs. Bantry admitted, "but there's talk he's not above cutting corners." And he was at the cottage the night before Celeste vanished. Mrs. Price saw his Rolls-Royce parked outside. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if longing for her knitting needles. Money, she reflected, could twist loyalties as surely as love or envy. Lord Ashford's investment suggested faith in Celeste, but a man of his temperament might not take kindly to failure, or to secrets that threatened his interests. She recalled a local squire who had once pressured a tenant to sell land, his benevolence masking a colder intent. Lord Ashford, she decided, warranted closer scrutiny. Finally, there was Madame Elise Dubois, a rival designer whose star had dimmed in recent years. Once a name to rival Celeste's, Elise had struggled to maintain her place in the fickle world of fashion. Now in her 40s, she was a striking woman, with sharp features and a wardrobe that spoke of faded glory. "She's staying at the manor house," Mrs. Bantry said, lowering her voice. "Came down a week ago, supposedly to sketch the countryside, but everyone knows she's jealous of Celeste. They were friends once, you know, but there was a falling out, something about a stolen design years back." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. Envy, she knew, was a poison that could fester for years, driving even the most refined to desperate acts. She thought of a village spinster who had sabotaged a rival's prize roses out of spite, her smile as sweet as her heart was bitter. Elise's presence in St. Mary Mead so close to Celeste's preparations was no coincidence, Miss Marple felt sure. but had envy turned to something darker? As the tea party wound down, Miss Marple excused herself, her mind alight with the threads of the mystery. Each suspect, Clara, Isabella, Lord Ashford, and Elise, had a motive, however veiled, and an opportunity, however fleeting. Clara's nervousness suggested a burden she carried. Isabella's ambition hinted at a willingness to shift allegiances. Lord Ashford's wealth carried the weight of expectation, and Elise's envy burned with the intensity of a fading star. Yet none, Miss Marple knew, could be judged too hastily. Human nature, as she had observed in countless village intrigues, was a tapestry of contradictions, its patterns emerging only with patience. She stepped into the late afternoon light, her straw hat shielding her from the sun's warmth. The village was quiet now, the tea party's chatter replaced by the hum of bees and the distant clatter of a cart. Miss Marple made her way toward the church, where she often found clarity amid the ancient stones. As she passed Rose Cottage, she paused, her gaze lingering on the atelier's open window. A breeze stirred the curtains, and for a moment she imagined Celeste's presence, her elegant hands sketching, her mind weaving dreams into fabric. Where was she now? Hidden, harmed, or perhaps fled of her own accord? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the atelier itself, that scene of quiet disruption. The overturned chair, the half-stitched gown, the smudge on the sill, they were clues, small but telling, like the dropped stitch in a knitting pattern that betrayed a larger flaw. She resolved to visit Clara again, perhaps with a basket of scones to loosen the girl's tongue. Clara, she sensed, held a key whether she knew it or not, and Isabella, with her letters and ambitions, must be watched. Lord Ashford's late-night visit demanded explanation, and Elise's bitterness could not be dismissed. As she reached the churchyard, Miss Marple sat on a bench, her hands resting in her lap. The village spread before her, its secrets tucked behind lace curtains and garden hedges. She thought of the many mysteries she had unravelled in St. Mary Mead, each beginning with a single thread, a glance, a word, a misstep. Madame Celeste's disappearance was no different. The cast of suspects with their motives and masks would reveal themselves in time, as surely as the seasons turned. For now, Miss Marple contented herself with observation. She would attend the village exhibition of Celeste's past designs tomorrow, where Clara, Isabella, and perhaps Elise would be present. Lord Ashford, too, might make an appearance, his presence a reminder of the stakes at play. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already mapping the interactions, the glances, the silences that spoke louder than words. In St. Mary Mead, as in life, the truth was never far from the surface, waiting only for a keen eye to uncover it. Chapter 3. A glimpse of envy. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, with its polished oak floors and slightly musty air, was an unlikely stage for the drama that unfolded the following day. A modest exhibition of Madame Celeste's past designs had been organized as a gesture of support, a way to keep her name alive amid the whispers of her disappearance. The hall was adorned with mannequins draped in Celeste's creations, gowns of ethereal chiffon, tailored jackets with daring lines, and delicate shawls that seemed to capture moonlight. Villagers milled about, their curiosity mingling with admiration, while the scent of tea and freshly baked scones wafted from a table in the corner. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her usual tweed and a neat black hat, moved through the crowd with the unobtrusive grace of a shadow, her eyes missing nothing. She had come, ostensibly, to admire the designs, but her true purpose was to observe the players in this unfolding mystery. The exhibition offered a rare opportunity to see Clara Wren, Isabella Voss, and perhaps even Madame Elise Dubois in one place, their interactions a tapestry of clues waiting to be unravelled. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the pins in Celeste's atelier, was already threading together the fragments she had gathered. Clara's trembling hands, the smudge on the atelier's windowsill, and the rumours of Lord Ashford's late-night visit. Each was a stitch in the pattern, but the design was far from clear. As she paused before a velvet gown with intricate beadwork, Miss Marple overheard a conversation that prickled her senses. Madame Elise Dubois, resplendent in a burgundy dress that spoke of better days, stood near a display of sketches, her voice low but cutting. She was speaking to Mrs. Price, the innkeeper's wife, whose penchant for gossip rivalled her skill with a rolling pin. "It's no wonder Celeste has Lord Ashford's backing," Elise said, her French accent lending a sharp edge to her words. "She's always had a knack for charming the right people. Talent alone doesn't secure such patronage, you know." Mrs. Price nodded eagerly, her eyes gleaming. "Oh, quite. But they say her designs are revolutionary. Surely that counts for something." Elise's lips curled into a smile that held no warmth. "Revolutionary, perhaps. Or perhaps she's merely adept at borrowing ideas and passing them off as her own." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Miss Marple, adjusting her spectacles, noted the glint in Elise's eyes. A flicker of envy so raw it was almost palpable. She recalled a village seamstress who had once accused a rival of copying her patterns, her bitterness masking a deeper wound. Envy, Miss Marple knew, could fester into something far more dangerous than words. She moved on, her steps slow and deliberate, pausing to admire a silk scarf embroidered with peonies. Clara Wren was nearby, fussing over a display of accessories. The young assistant's hands moved with practiced skill, but her movements were jerky, as if she were a marionette with tangled strings. Miss Marple approached, her smile as gentle as a summer breeze. "Such lovely work, Clara," she said, gesturing to the scarf. "You must be very proud to be part of Madame Celeste's vision." Clara's cheeks flushed, and she ducked her head. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she murmured, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "It's all her doing, really. I just help with the details." Her voice faltered, and she glanced toward the crowd, her eyes darting to where Elise stood, now chatting with a local merchant. Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting the tension in Clara's posture. Was it fear of Elise, or something else? She thought of a young maid in St. Mary Mead who had trembled similarly when questioned about a missing brooch, her guilt betrayed by her inability to meet anyone's eyes. "Such a pity about Madame Celeste," Miss Marple continued, her tone light but probing. "You must be dreadfully worried. Were you with her long yesterday?" She watched Clara closely, her mild expression masking the intensity of her scrutiny. Clara's hands stilled, and for a moment she seemed to hold her breath. I left at 10, as I told the inspector," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was working on the sapphire gown. She seemed fine." The hesitation was slight, but to Miss Marple it was as telling as a dropped stitch. Clara knew something, or feared something, and it was more than the shock of her employer's absence. Before Miss Marple could press further, a ripple of excitement passed through the crowd. Isabella Voss had arrived, her entrance as dramatic as a stage star's. She wore a simple yet striking dress, undoubtedly one of Celeste's creations, that accentuated her willowy frame and drew every eye. Her dark hair was swept up, revealing a neck as graceful as a swan's, and her smile was calculated to charm. She moved through the hall, pausing to accept compliments and pose beside the mannequins, her presence a living advertisement for Celeste's genius. Yet Miss Marple, watching from her corner, noted a restlessness in Isabella's movements, a flicker of unease in her eyes when she glanced at Clara. Miss Marple made her way toward the tea table, where Mrs. Bantry was holding court. "Isn't she a vision?" Mrs. Bantry said, nodding towards Isabella. "But I wonder, Jane, if she's quite as devoted to Celeste as she seems. Mrs. Price mentioned those letters again, fancy ones delivered to the inn. Could be someone trying to poach her, don't you think?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the possibility. "It's not uncommon," she said, "for young women with talent to attract attention, but attention can be a double-edged sword." She thought of a village girl who had once been lured by promises of fame, only to find herself entangled in deceit. Isabella's ambition was evident, but was it strong enough to lead her to betray Celeste, or to know more about her disappearance than she let on? As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations. She noted how Elise lingered near Celeste's sketches, her fingers brushing the paper as if memorizing its lines. She saw Clara avoid Isabella, her shoulders hunching whenever the model drew near, and she overheard a snippet of conversation between two village matrons who whispered that Lord Ashford had been seen leaving the Beb Manor in a temper the previous evening, his car speeding toward London. The pieces were scattered, but to Miss Marple they were beginning to form a pattern, faint but discernible, like the outline of a design before the fabric is cut. She left the hall as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the village green. The exhibition had been a success, raising funds for the church roof and keeping Celeste's name in the village's heart. But for Miss Marple, it had been a window into the souls of those closest to the missing designer. Elise's envy was a thread that ran deep, Clara's fear a knot that needed untying, and Isabella's charm a veil that might conceal darker intentions. Lord Ashford, absent from the event, remained a shadow in the background, his motives as opaque as the tinted windows of his Rolls-Royce. As she walked home, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the atelier. The overturned chair, the half-finished gown, the smudge on the sill. They were clues, small but significant, and she felt certain that the exhibition had added another. Elise's words about Celeste's borrowed ideas suggested a grudge that had not faded with time. Clara's nervousness hinted at a secret, perhaps one she was too frightened to share. And Isabella's poise, so carefully maintained, could mask a heart swayed by ambition. Miss Marple's steps were slow, her mind as busy as her knitting needles, weaving the threads of envy, fear, and ambition into a pattern that would in time reveal the truth. She reached Danemead Cottage as dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, the air heavy with the scent of roses. Sitting in her armchair, she picked up her knitting, the soft click of needles a counterpoint to her thoughts. The mystery of Madame Celeste's disappearance was a puzzle, but Miss Marple had solved many such puzzles before. In the quiet of her cottage, with the village settling into night, she felt the familiar stir of anticipation. The truth, she knew, was like a well-stitched seam, hidden at first, but certain to hold when the fabric was turned right side out. Chapter 4. The Model's Secret. The Blue Boar Inn, nestled at the edge of St. Mary Mead's village green, was a place of cosy charm, its low beams and flickering hearth welcoming travellers and locals alike. Yet, beneath its homely exterior, it was a crucible for gossip, where secrets were traded as freely as pints of ale. Miss Jane Marple, ever adept at blending into the fabric of village life, decided that a visit to the inn was in order. Her pretext was simple: a church pamphlet to deliver, a small act of parish duty that would raise no eyebrows. But her true purpose was to observe Isabella Voss, the luminous model whose presence in Celeste's orbit had begun to intrigue her. The morning was crisp, with a hint of autumn in the air, and Miss Marple set out with her basket, her mind as sharp as the breeze that rustled the leaves. Isabella, she had learned, was staying in one of the inn's best rooms, a fact that spoke of her status as Celeste's chosen muse. The model's beauty had been the talk of the village since her arrival, her every movement drawing eyes like moths to a flame. Yet Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, suspected that beauty often served as a mask, concealing ambitions or fears that lay beneath. The snippets of gossip from the exhibition, those mysterious letters, Isabella's fleeting unease, had planted a seed of curiosity, and Miss Marple intended to nurture it. The inn's parlour was quiet when she arrived, save for the clink of teacups and the murmur of Mrs. Price, the innkeeper's wife, chatting with a barmaid. Isabella sat by a window, her dark hair catching the light as she pored over a fashion magazine. Her posture was studied, as if she knew she was being watched, yet there was a tension in her shoulders that Miss Marple noted at once. She approached, her smile as warm as the hearth. "Good morning, Miss Voss," she said, holding out the pamphlet. "I thought you might like this for the church fete. We do so value our visitors' support." Isabella looked up, her green eyes bright but guarded. "Oh, how kind," she said, taking the pamphlet with a practised smile. "I'm afraid I'm not much for church events, but I'll have a look." Her voice was smooth, with a trace of a London accent, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in her fingers as she set the pamphlet aside. "Such a lovely village," Miss Marple continued, settling into a chair as if invited. "It must be a change from the bustle of London. I imagine you're quite busy, preparing for the gala with Madame Celeste." She paused, her tone gentle but her eyes keen, watching for any flicker of reaction. Isabella's smile faltered, just for a moment. "Yes, it's been quite an experience," she said, her gaze drifting to the window. "Celeste is brilliant, of course. It's an honour to wear her designs." The words were correct, but they lacked warmth, as if recited from a script. Miss Marple, who had once coaxed a confession from a shy village girl over a lost locket, knew the signs of evasion. "I'm sure it is," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "Though it must be trying with her disappearance. You must be dreadfully worried." She leaned forward slightly, her expression one of kindly concern, but her mind was threading together the clues. Isabella's poise, the rumours of letters, the unease she had shown at the exhibition. Isabella hesitated, her fingers toying with the edge of the magazine. "It's awful," she said at last. "I can't imagine where she's gone. We were so close to finishing the collection." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, but only briefly, before darting away. "I've told the inspector all I know. I was at the inn that night, not at the cottage." Miss Marple nodded, her face a picture of sympathy. "Of course, my dear. It's only natural to want to help. Though I did hear, such gossip in villages, you know, that you've been receiving some rather special letters, perhaps from an admirer." She let the question hang, light as a feather, but with the weight of intent behind it. Isabella's cheeks flushed, a delicate pink that contrasted with her composed demeanour. "Letters?" she said, her voice a touch too sharp. "Oh, just fan mail, you know. Models get them all the time." She laughed, but it was a brittle sound, like glass on the verge of cracking. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes never leaving Isabella's face. She thought of a young actress in St. Mary Mead, whose love letters had hidden a blackmailer's threat, and wondered what secrets Isabella's correspondence might conceal. Before she could press further, Mrs. Price bustled over, her apron dusted with flour. "Miss Marple, will you have a cup of tea?" she asked, her eyes flicking to Isabella with barely concealed curiosity. "Miss Voss was just telling me about the gala. Such a shame, with Madame Celeste missing. They say another designer's been sniffing about, offering her a contract. Elise Dubois, wasn't it?" Isabella's expression tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Nothing's been decided," she said quickly. "I'm loyal to Celeste. She's done so much for me." The words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the way Isabella's hand clenched the magazine, crumpling its edge. Loyalty, she knew, could be a fragile thing, easily swayed by promises of fame or fortune. Mrs. Price, oblivious to the undercurrent, prattled on. "Well, I heard Elise Dubois was at the cottage last week before all this happened. Arguing with Celeste, they say. Something about designs being stolen. Can you imagine?" She shook her head, her earrings jangling. Miss Marple filed the information away, her mind returning to Elise's bitter words at the exhibition. A rivalry, it seemed, was at the heart of this mystery. But how far had it driven Elise, or Isabella? Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "I mustn't keep you, Miss Voss," she said, "but do come to the fete. It's a small thing, but we do like to make our guests feel at home." She smiled, her eyes lingering on Isabella's face, searching for the truth behind the model's polished exterior. As she left the inn, the pamphlet forgotten on the table, Miss Marple felt the weight of a new thread in the tapestry of the case. Isabella's unease, her quick denial of the letters, and the mention of Elise's offer pointed to a web of ambition and betrayal. She walked slowly back to Danemead Cottage, her basket swinging lightly at her side. The village was stirring now, with children playing on the green and the postman making his rounds. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. Isabella's secret, she felt certain, lay in those letters. Perhaps an offer from Elise or another designer, tempting her to abandon Celeste. But had that temptation led to something more sinister? She recalled a village scandal years ago, where a young woman's ambition had drawn her into a dangerous bargain, and wondered if Isabella's beauty masked a similar misstep. As she reached her garden, Miss Marple paused to admire her roses, their petals soft against the morning light. The mystery of Madame Celeste's disappearance was growing more intricate, each suspect adding a new layer to the puzzle. Clara's fear, Elise's envy, Lord Ashford's shadowy presence, and now Isabella's secret. All were threads that needed careful handling. She settled into her armchair, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm, and let her mind wander over the clues. The truth, she knew, was like a well-fitted gown. It required patience to cut, precision to stitch, and a keen eye to see the final design. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets bloomed as readily as her roses, Miss Marple was confident that the pattern would soon emerge. Chapter 5. The Sponsor's Shadow. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Ashford Manor, a Georgian pile that stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead like a sentinel of wealth and tradition. Its stone facade, softened by climbing ivy, spoke of old money and older secrets. And it was here that Miss Jane Marple found herself, invited under the guise of discussing the village's charity bazaar. In truth, her visit was prompted by a growing curiosity about Lord Reginald Ashford, the enigmatic sponsor whose financial backing had propelled Madame Celeste's collection toward the London Fashion Gala. His late-night visit to the atelier, mentioned in passing by the manor's housekeeper, had piqued Miss Marple's interest, for she knew that men of power often cast shadows far longer than their deeds. She was ushered into the manor's drawing-room by a maid whose starched apron rustled with every step. The room was a study in opulence. Mahogany furniture gleamed under the light of a crystal chandelier, and portraits of stern-faced Ashfords gazed down from the walls. Lord Ashford himself stood by the fireplace, a tall figure with a hawk-like profile and eyes that missed little. At 50, he retained a youthful vigour, though his greying temples and the lines etched around his mouth hinted at a life of calculated risks. He greeted Miss Marple with a courteous smile, offering her a seat and a glass of sherry, which she accepted with her usual demure grace. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as polished oak, "it's a pleasure to have you here. The bazaar, I understand, is a cause close to your heart. I'm happy to contribute, though I confess my mind has been on other matters." He gestured vaguely, but his eyes held a sharpness that belied his casual tone. Miss Marple sipped her sherry, her expression one of mild interest. "How kind of you, Lord Ashford," she replied. "The village is so grateful for your generosity. Though I imagine Madame Celeste's disappearance must be a great concern, especially with your investment in her work." Her tone was gentle, but her words were a delicate probe, testing the waters of his composure. Lord Ashford's smile tightened, though only for a moment. "A terrible business," he said, settling into an armchair opposite her. "Celeste is a genius, and her collection is, well, was set to be the talk of London. My investment was substantial, but it's not merely the money. Her vision is irreplaceable." He paused, swirling the sherry in his glass. "I trust the police are doing all they can." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. She noted the careful choice of words, the way he emphasized his concern for Celeste's vision rather than her person. It reminded her of a village squire who had once spoken glowingly of a tenant's orchard while plotting to seize the land. "Indeed," she said, "though it must be trying, not knowing where she is. I understand you visited her atelier the night before she vanished. Such a late call must have been urgent." The faintest flicker of surprise crossed Lord Ashford's face, quickly masked by a rueful smile. "Village gossip travels fast," he said, his tone light but guarded. "Yes, I stopped by to discuss the gala's arrangements. Celeste was under pressure, you know. Deadlines, fittings, all that. I wanted to ensure everything was on track." He leaned back, his posture relaxed, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw, a telltale sign of unease. She smiled, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Of course," she said. "It's only natural for a patron to take such an interest, though it must have been a shock to find her gone the next morning." She let the words hang, her voice as soft as the ticking of the mantel clock. But her mind was alert, sifting through his response for any hint of dissembling. Lord Ashford met her gaze, his eyes cool and assessing. "A shock, yes," he said. "I've told Inspector Harrow all I know. I left her at about 9, working as usual. She seemed preoccupied, but nothing out of the ordinary." He rose, as if to signal the end of the topic, and moved to a sideboard to refill his glass. "Now, about the bazaar. Perhaps a donation for the church roof." Miss Marple allowed the subject to shift, discussing the bazaar with her usual quiet enthusiasm, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Lord Ashford's account was plausible, yet it lacked the warmth of genuine concern. His visit to the atelier, so close to the time of Celeste's disappearance, was a thread that needed pulling. She recalled a merchant in St. Mary Mead who had claimed a late-night visit was merely business, only for it to mask a heated dispute over debts. Was Lord Ashford's call truly about the gala, or had something more pressing and more sinister prompted it? As she sipped her sherry, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the room's details. A silver cigarette case on the table, engraved with initials not Ashford's. A photograph of a yacht, its name obscured but suggesting wealth beyond the manor's walls. And a faint scent of cigar smoke, unusual for a man who claimed to abstain. These were small things, but to Miss Marple they were like the stray threads in a seam, hinting at a larger pattern. She thought of the atelier's overturned chair, the smudge on the sill, and now Lord Ashford's guarded demeanour. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. The conversation turned to village matters, and Miss Marple played her part, offering suggestions for the bazaar stalls, while steering clear of further probing. She knew better than to press too hard. Men like Lord Ashford, accustomed to control, were more likely to reveal themselves through carelessness than confrontation. As she rose to leave, thanking him for his hospitality, she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, "I do hope Madame Celeste is found soon. It would be such a pity for her collection to go unseen, especially with so much at stake." Lord Ashford's smile was impeccable, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed, Miss Marple," he said, "a great pity." He escorted her to the door, his courtesy flawless, but Miss Marple felt the weight of his gaze as she stepped into the evening air. The manor's gravel drive crunched under her feet, and she paused to admire the roses, their blooms heavy with dusk's dew. But her mind was far from flowers, weaving instead the threads of Lord Ashford's words and silences. As she walked back to St. Mary Mead, the village settling into the quiet of twilight, Miss Marple reflected on the cast of suspects. Clara's fear, Isabella's secret letters, Elisa's envy, and now Lord Ashford's calculated reserve. Each added a layer to the mystery. His late-night visit to the atelier, described as routine yet shrouded in ambiguity, suggested a man with more at stake than mere patronage. She thought of a village banker who had once invested in a failing shop, his concern masking a desire to control its assets. Was Lord Ashford's interest in Celeste purely financial, or did it conceal a deeper motive? Reaching Dinemede Cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The manor's opulence, Lord Ashford's guarded words, and the housekeeper's whispered gossip about his temper were all threads in the tapestry of Celeste's disappearance. She recalled the smudge on the atelier's sill, the overturned chair, and the half-stitched gown, clues that pointed to a struggle, or at least a hasty departure. Had Lord Ashford's visit been the catalyst, or was he merely a bystander in a larger drama? The village was silent now, save for the distant hoot of an owl. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind as busy as ever. The truth, she knew, was like a well-tailored coat. It required careful measurement and precise stitching to reveal its form. Lord Ashford's shadow loomed large, but it was only one part of the pattern. Clara, Isabella, and Elise each held their own secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel them, one delicate thread at a time. Chapter 6. A Clue in the Threads. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of its cottages and lending an air of quiet mystery to the village. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, stood at her garden gate, her eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of Rose Cottage. The disappearance of Madame Celeste had woven a web of intrigue that seemed to tighten with each passing day, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of determination. The atelier, with its overturned chair and half-stitched gown, held secrets that could not be ignored, and she resolved to examine it more closely. A polite request to Inspector Harrow, couched in terms of neighbourly concern, had secured her permission to visit the scene, provided she was accompanied by a constable. With her basket on her arm, ostensibly filled with knitting supplies, Miss Marple set out, her steps as measured as her thoughts. The atelier, a converted barn behind Rose Cottage, was a place of both industry and artistry. Its high windows allowed light to flood the space, illuminating racks of shimmering fabrics and tables strewn with sketches. Yet, as Miss Marple stepped inside, accompanied by the young Constable Reed, she sensed an undercurrent of disarray that belied the room's creative purpose. The overturned chair still lay where Clara had found it, its splintered back a silent witness to some sudden disruption. The sapphire taffeta gown on the central mannequin trailed threads, as if abandoned mid-stitch, and a scattering of pins glinted on the floor like fallen stars. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in every detail, her mind weaving connections as deftly as her knitting needles. Constable Reed, an earnest young man with a tendency to fidget, stood by the door, his notebook at the ready. "Inspector says it's likely she left in a hurry," he offered, his voice tinged with the deference he reserved for Miss Marple, whose reputation for unravelling mysteries was whispered even in police circles. "No signs of a struggle, he thinks, but we've not found much else." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild agreement, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She moved slowly through the room, her fingers brushing the edge of a table where a sketchbook lay open, its pages filled with Celeste's bold, flowing lines. The designs were exquisite, each a testament to her genius. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a corner of the room, near an open window. The latch was unfastened, as she had noted on her first visit, and a faint smudge of dirt marred the sill. She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. The smudge was not merely dirt, but a streak of something darker, perhaps oil, or the residue of a glove. It was a small thing, but to Miss Marple it was as significant as a dropped stitch in a carefully knit shawl. She turned her attention to the floor beneath the window, where a glint caught her eye. Kneeling with a grace that belied her years, she retrieved a scrap of silk, no larger than a handkerchief, caught in a splinter of the wooden frame. Its pattern was distinctive, a swirl of emerald and gold, unlike anything in Celeste's collection. Miss Marple held it to the light, her mind racing. She recalled seeing a similar fabric, a scarf perhaps, worn by Madame Elise Dubois at the village exhibition. The memory was vivid. Elise's burgundy dress, her bitter words about Celeste, and the scarf draped carelessly over her shoulder. Could it be a coincidence, or had Elise left a trace of her presence? "Constable," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but commanding, "might you hold this for me?" She handed him the scrap, noting his careful handling as he placed it in an evidence envelope. She did not mention her suspicion about Elise, for she knew better than to leap to conclusions. Instead, she tucked the observation away, like a skein of wool saved for the right moment. "Such a curious thing to find," she mused, as if to herself. "It makes one wonder how it came to be here." Constable Reed nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "Could be nothing, ma'am," he said. "But we'll have it looked at. The inspector's been over this place twice, but he says you've a way of seeing what others miss." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with a modesty that masked her quiet pride. "Oh, I'm just an old woman with too much time on her hands," she said. But her mind was already threading the silk scrap into the larger pattern of the case. She moved to a workbench, where a pair of scissors lay beside a spool of thread. The scissors were slightly askew, as if dropped in haste, and a single thread of sapphire taffeta clung to their blade. It matched the gown on the mannequin, suggesting that Celeste had been working when interrupted. But by whom? And why? She glanced at the constable, who was now examining a rack of fabrics with a slightly bored air. "Tell me, Constable Reed," she said, "has anyone mentioned seeing visitors to the atelier that night? Apart from Lord Ashford, I mean." Her tone was casual, but her question was precise, designed to draw out any overlooked detail. The constable frowned, consulting his notebook. "Not much, ma'am. Clara Wren said she left at 10, and Lord Ashford told the inspector he was here till 9. No one else reported, though the neighbours say it's a quiet lane. Mind you, Mrs. Price at the inn mentioned hearing a motor car late that night, but she couldn't say whose." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. A motor car, she thought, could belong to anyone. Lord Ashford, returning despite his claim. Elise, perhaps driven by her envy. Or even an unknown player in this intricate game. She recalled a village theft, years ago, where a bicycle's tyre marks had led to the culprit's door. Small clues, she knew, could unravel great mysteries. As she continued her inspection, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small sewing box, its lid ajar. Inside, among spools and needles, was a single pearl button, its lustre dulled by a faint stain, perhaps ink or something more sinister. It seemed out of place among Celeste's meticulous tools, and Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire about its origin. Had it been dropped by a visitor, or was it a relic of Celeste's work? She thought of a village seamstress who had once hidden a stolen brooch in her sewing kit, believing it safe from prying eyes. The button, like the silk scrap, was a clue that demanded context. Satisfied that she had seen all she could for now, Miss Marple thanked Constable Reed and stepped out into the morning air. The mist was lifting, revealing the gentle slopes of the countryside, but her thoughts were as clear as the sky above. The silk scrap, with its emerald and gold pattern, pointed to Elise Dubois, whose envy had been so palpable at the exhibition. The smudge on the sill, the overturned chair, and the pearl button were threads that did not yet align, but Miss Marple was patient. She knew that mysteries, like her knitting, required time to reveal their patterns. As she walked back to Danemead Cottage, her basket swinging lightly, Miss Marple considered the suspects. Clara's fear, Isabella's secret letters, Lord Ashford's guarded account, and now Elise's possible presence in the atelier. All were pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking shape. The silk scrap was a tangible clue, one she would keep to herself until the moment was right. She recalled a village scandal where a single ribbon had led to the discovery of a theft, and she felt certain that this scrap would prove equally significant. Settling into her armchair, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the soft click of needles a counterpoint to her thoughts. The atelier had spoken, in its silent way, of haste and disruption, and the silk scrap whispered of Elise's involvement. But was it evidence of a visit, a confrontation, or something more? Miss Marple's mind wove through the possibilities, her hands steady as she worked. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as common as the roses in her garden, the truth was never far from the surface, waiting for a keen eye to pluck it free. Chapter 7. The Assistant's Burden. The gardens of St. Mary Mead, with their neatly trimmed hedges and vibrant blooms, were a haven of tranquillity, a place where villagers sought solace from the daily whirl of gossip and chores. It was here, on a mild afternoon with clouds drifting lazily across a pale sky, that Miss Jane Marple arranged to meet Clara Wren. The pretext was simple, a shared walk to discuss the church flower show. But Miss Marple's true aim was to probe the young assistant's nervous demeanour, which had grown more pronounced since Madame Celeste's disappearance. Clara's trembling hands and fleeting glances at the exhibition, coupled with her reticence in the atelier, suggested a burden too heavy for her slight shoulders. Miss Marple, with her gentle manner and unerring instinct for human frailty, knew that a quiet conversation might loosen the threads of Clara's secret. Clara arrived at the garden gate promptly, her plain cotton dress and sensible shoes a stark contrast to the opulent fabrics she handled in Celeste's atelier. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed, and she clutched a small embroidered handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. Miss Marple greeted her warmly, her smile as soothing as the scent of lavender that hung in the air. "Clara, my dear," she said, gesturing to a path lined with roses, "how kind of you to join me. I find a walk in the gardens does wonders for the spirit, especially in such trying times." Clara managed a faint smile, though her eyes darted to the side as if expecting an unseen watcher. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she murmured. "It's good to get out." Her voice was soft, almost swallowed by the rustle of leaves, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twisted the handkerchief, its delicate stitches fraying at the edges. They strolled along the path, the crunch of gravel underfoot, a gentle rhythm. Miss Marple began with talk of the flower show, praising Clara's skill with embroidery as akin to the artistry of a well-arranged bouquet. "Your work on Madame Celeste's designs is quite remarkable," she said, her tone light but deliberate. "Such precision must require great trust between you and her. It's a pity, this dreadful business of her disappearance. You must feel it keenly, being so close to her." Clara's steps faltered, and she bit her lip. "I do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been so good to me, teaching me everything. I can't believe she's gone." The words were heartfelt, but there was a tremor in them, a note of fear that Miss Marple recognized from countless village confidences. She thought of a young maid in St. Mary Mead, who had wept over a broken vase, her tears masking guilt over a far greater transgression. They paused by a bench beneath a willow, its branches swaying like a curtain. Miss Marple sat, patting the seat beside her. "Come, my dear," she said. "You look as if you've not slept a wink. It's only natural to be troubled, but sometimes sharing a worry lightens the load." Her eyes, mild behind her spectacles, held Clara's with a quiet intensity, inviting trust without demanding it. Clara hesitated, then sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, she was silent, her gaze fixed on a distant bed of marigolds. Then, as if the words could no longer be contained, she spoke. "I heard something, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and urgent. "A few days before she vanished, there was an argument at the atelier. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd gone back for my shawl, but I heard voices. Madame Celeste and Madame Dubois." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained serene. "Elise Dubois?" she asked, as if merely clarifying. "How extraordinary! What were they arguing about?" Clara's fingers tightened on the handkerchief, tearing a small stitch. "Elise accused Celeste of stealing her designs," she said, her words tumbling out. "She said Celeste had taken ideas from her old collections and passed them off as new. Celeste was furious. She said it was nonsense, that her work was her own. I didn't stay to hear more. I was afraid they'd see me. But it was so unlike Celeste to raise her voice. She's always so calm." Miss Marple nodded, her mind threading this new information into the tapestry of the case. The silk scrap found in the atelier, with its emerald and gold pattern, flashed in her memory. Could it be linked to this confrontation? She recalled Elise's bitter words at the exhibition, her envy as sharp as a needle. "That must have been distressing to hear," she said gently. "Did you tell Madame Celeste you overheard?" Clara shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, I couldn't. I didn't want her to think I was eavesdropping. And then she was gone." Her voice broke, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips, as if to stifle a sob. Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing, but her mind was racing. Clara's fear suggested more than mere loyalty. It hinted at a secret she was desperate to keep. "Was there anything else, Clara?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as soft as the breeze. "Anything that might help the inspector? You are so close to Madame Celeste. You might have noticed something others missed." She watched Clara closely, noting the way her shoulders hunched, as if bracing against an unseen weight. Clara's eyes flickered to Miss Marple's, then away, her breath catching. I don't know," she stammered. "There was nothing else, really, just the argument. I told the inspector about leaving at 10, and that's all I know." But her voice was too quick, her denial too emphatic, and Miss Marple's keen senses caught the lie as clearly as a dropped stitch in her knitting. Clara was holding something back, something that frightened her deeply. Miss Marple did not press further, knowing that fear could clamp a tongue as tightly as guilt. Instead she smiled, her eyes warm with understanding. "You've been very brave, my dear," she said. "These things are never easy. If you think of anything else, you know where to find me." She rose, adjusting her shawl, and Clara followed, her expression a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. As they parted at the garden gate, Miss Marple watched Clara hurry back toward Rose Cottage, her figure small against the fading light. The assistant's revelation about the argument was a vital thread, tying Elise Dubois more firmly to the mystery. But Clara's fear, her refusal to meet Miss Marple's eyes, suggested a deeper involvement, perhaps not in Celeste's disappearance, but in something that weighed heavily on her conscience. Miss Marple thought of a village girl who had once concealed a theft out of fear of a bullying employer, and wondered if Clara's loyalty to Celeste was tinged with a similar dread. Returning to Denemmid Cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly. The case was growing more intricate, each suspect adding a new layer to the puzzle. The silk scrap in the atelier, the smudge on the sill, Lord Ashford's late-night visit, Isabella's secret letters, and now Clara's account of the argument, all were threads in a complex design. Elise's accusation of stolen designs pointed to a motive rooted in professional rivalry, but Clara's fear hinted at a personal stake, perhaps a threat or a promise that kept her silent. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the possibilities. Had Elise confronted Celeste in the atelier that night, leaving the silk scrap as evidence of her presence? Had Clara witnessed more than she admitted, her fear stemming from what she saw or heard? The pearl button in the sewing box, the overturned chair, the half-stitched gown, all whispered of a sudden disruption. But the truth remained elusive, like a pattern half-sewn. Miss Marple knew that patience was her greatest ally. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets bloomed as readily as her roses, the truth would surface, given time and a gentle hand to guide it. Chapter 8. The Rival's Gambit. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, its walls adorned with faded bunting from past fetes, was once again the stage for a gathering that buzzed with the undercurrent of intrigue. A charity auction, organised to raise funds for the local orphanage, had drawn a crowd of villagers eager to bid on homemade jams, knitted scarves, and a few choice items donated by the gentry. Among these was a preview gown from Madame Elise Dubois' forthcoming collection, a piece that had sparked whispers even before the auctioneer's gavel struck. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the back with her knitting bag at her feet, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness, her eyes as sharp as the needles she wielded. The auction was a perfect opportunity to watch Elise Dubois, whose envy of Madame Celeste had taken on a darker hue with Clara's revelation of their heated argument. The hall was alive with the hum of voices, the rustle of programs, and the occasional clink of teacups. Elise stood near the front, her posture regal despite the slight weariness in her eyes. Her burgundy dress, though elegant, seemed a touch dated, a reminder of her fading star in the world of fashion. The gown on display, draped over a mannequin, was a striking creation. A cascade of midnight blue silk with intricate silver embroidery that shimmered under the hall's lights. Yet, to Miss Marple's discerning eye, it bore an uncanny resemblance to Celeste's signature style. The bold lines, the delicate stitching, the way the fabric seemed to dance with movement. She recalled the sketches in Celeste's atelier, their flowing elegance, and felt a prickle of suspicion. As the auctioneer introduced the gown, Elise stepped forward, her smile practiced but strained. "A unique piece," she declared, her French accent lending a touch of glamour to her words. "A glimpse of what my collection will bring to London. I'm delighted to contribute it for such a worthy cause." The crowd murmured approval, but Miss Marple caught the whispers that followed. "It's so like Celeste's work," said Mrs. Bantry, seated nearby. "Almost too like, if you ask me." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap, though her hands were still, her attention fixed on Elise. The rival designer's presence in St. Mary Mead, so close to Celeste's disappearance, was no mere coincidence, and the gown's similarity to Celeste's designs suggested a boldness that bordered on audacity. She thought of a village baker who had once passed off a neighbour's recipe as his own, his bravado unravelling when a single ingredient betrayed him. Was Elise so confident in Celeste's absence that she would parade her rival's style as her own? The bidding began, and the gown drew spirited offers, driven by the villagers' curiosity as much as their generosity. Miss Marple watched Elise closely, noting the way her eyes darted to the crowd, as if seeking approval, or perhaps gauging suspicion. Clara Wren was there, standing near the back, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly. Isabella Voss, resplendent in a tailored coat that could only be Celeste's, hovered near the tea-table, her smile bright, but her gaze restless. Lord Ashford was absent, a fact that did not escape Miss Marple's notice, though his housekeeper had mentioned he was in London on business. The absence of one player only sharpened her focus on those present. As the auctioneer's hammer fell, the gown sold to a local merchant's wife for a tidy sum. Elise accepted the applause with a nod, but Miss Marple saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes, a glint that spoke of more than charitable pride. She recalled the silk scrap found in the atelier, its emerald and gold pattern matching Elise's scarf, and Clara's account of the argument over stolen designs. The gown, she felt certain, was a thread that tied Elise to Celeste's disappearance, but its significance remained elusive, like a pattern glimpsed through a veil. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and made her way to the tea-table, where Isabella was chatting with Mrs. Price. "Such a lovely event," she said, accepting a cup with a smile. "And that gown, quite remarkable. It reminds me so of Madame Celeste's work. Don't you think, Miss Voss?" Her tone was innocent, but her eyes were keen, watching for Isabella's reaction. Isabella's smile faltered, her fingers tightening on her teacup. "Oh, it's similar, I suppose," she said, her voice light but strained. "But Elise has her own style, doesn't she? It's just the fashion of the moment." She glanced toward Elise, who was now speaking with the auctioneer, and Miss Marple noted the unease in her posture, as if she feared being overheard. Mrs. Price, never one to miss a chance for gossip, leaned in. "That's what I said to Mr. Price last night," she whispered. "It's as if Elise got hold of Celeste's sketches somehow. They say she's been working day and night since Celeste vanished. Odd, isn't it?" She raised an eyebrow, her eyes gleaming with speculation. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild surprise. "Dear me, how curious," she said, but her mind was racing. The whispers about Elise's sudden productivity, the gown's resemblance to Celeste's designs, and the silk scrap in the atelier formed a pattern that was growing clearer. She thought of a village seamstress who had once copied a rival's pattern, her haste leading to a telltale mistake in the stitching. Elise's gambit, it seemed, was to capitalize on Celeste's absence, but had she gone further, orchestrating that absence to steal her rival's work? As the auction wound down, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting bag a comforting weight at her side. She watched Elise move through the crowd, her charm masking the bitterness Clara had described. Clara herself avoided Elise, her eyes fixed on the floor, while Isabella's glances toward the rival designer held a mix of curiosity and caution. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the atelier. The overturned chair, the smudge on the sill, the pearl button in the sewing box. Each clue pointed to a moment of disruption, and Elise's gown suggested a motive that was both bold and desperate. She left the hall as the evening shadows lengthened, the village settling into its quiet rhythm. The air was cool, scented with wood smoke and the promise of autumn. And Miss Marple's steps were slow, her mind weaving through the threads of the case. Elise's envy, Clara's fear, Isabella's secret letters, and Lord Ashford's shadowy presence were all part of the design. But the gown at the auction was a new stitch, one that pointed directly to Elise's ambition. Had she stolen Celeste's designs, or had she taken a more drastic step to ensure her rival's silence? Reaching Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles resuming their steady click. The auction had revealed more than funds for the orphanage. It had exposed Elise's gambit, a move as calculated as it was risky. The silk scrap, the argument Clara overheard, and now the gown, all suggested that Elise had seized an opportunity, but at what cost? Miss Marple's mind wandered to a village scandal where a stolen recipe had led to a confrontation, the truth emerging only when the thief's confidence faltered. Elise, she felt certain, was treading a dangerous path, and the truth was close, waiting to be unpicked like a poorly sewn seam. Chapter 9. A Hidden Trail. The woods bordering St. Mary Mead, with their tangled undergrowth and ancient oaks, were a place of quiet beauty, rarely disturbed save by the occasional wanderer or child at play. On this particular morning, with a faint mist clinging to the ground and the air sharp with the scent of damp earth, Miss Jane Marple set out for a walk, her sturdy shoes crunching softly on the fallen leaves. Her ostensible purpose was to gather blackberries for a pie, her basket swinging lightly at her side. But her true intent was to explore a hunch that had taken root in her mind. The clues in the atelier, the silk scrap, the smudge on the sill, the pearl button, had begun to form a pattern, and Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unravelling village mysteries, urged her to look beyond the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead to the wilder edges of its landscape. Her thoughts were fixed on the night of Madame Celeste's disappearance, a night marked by the hum of a motor car, as Mrs. Price had mentioned, and the subtle signs of disruption in the atelier. The silk scrap, with its emerald and gold pattern linked to Elise Dubois, suggested a presence that could not be dismissed. Clara's account of the argument, Isabella's guarded unease, and Lord Ashford's evasive account of his late-night visit all pointed to a moment of conflict. But the where and how of Celeste's vanishing remained elusive. Miss Marple, with her knack for finding truth in the overlooked, wondered if the woods, so close to Rose Cottage, might hold a clue overlooked by Inspector Harrow's diligent but less imaginative search. As she followed a narrow path that skirted the village, her eyes caught a faint irregularity in the ground, tire tracks pressed into the soft earth where a vehicle had veered off the lane. They were faint, nearly erased by the morning's dew, but to Miss Marple they were as telling as a misplaced stitch in a seam. She paused, her basket resting against her hip, and traced the tracks with her gaze. They led toward a clearing where an old shed stood, its weathered boards half hidden by brambles. The shed was a relic of the village's past, once used by a groundskeeper but long abandoned, its door sagging on rusted hinges. Miss Marple approached with care, her steps silent on the mossy ground. The shed's isolation made it an unlikely place for casual visitors, yet the tire tracks suggested recent activity. She circled the structure, noting a broken branch nearby and a patch of trampled grass. As if someone had moved hastily. The door was ajar, secured only by a rusty padlock that hung loosely, as if forced. With a glance around to ensure she was alone, Miss Marple pushed the door open, its creak echoing in the stillness. Inside, the shed was dim, its air heavy with the musty scent of old wood and decay. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the cracked walls, illuminating a clutter of forgotten tools and crates. In the corner, partially covered by a tattered tarp, stood a wooden trunk, its surface scarred but sturdy. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. She lifted the tarp, revealing a lock that was new and gleaming, a stark contrast to the shed's decay. The lock was secure, but a faint scratch on its surface suggested an attempt to force it open, perhaps in haste. With a cautious glance at the door, Miss Marple knelt beside the trunk, her fingers tracing its edges. She had no tools to open it, but her keen eyes spotted a faint residue on the lock, white, powdery, like talc or perhaps something more sinister. She recalled a village theft where a powdery substance had led to a chemist's shop, and her mind turned to the possibility of chloroform, a substance she had read about in one of her nephew's detective novels. Could it be linked to Celeste's disappearance? A means to subdue her without a struggle? She straightened, her basket still in hand, and made a mental note to inform Inspector Harrow. The trunk, she felt certain, held something vital, perhaps Celeste's sketches, or evidence of a more desperate act. She stepped outside, closing the door as she found it, and retraced her steps to the path, her mind weaving the new discovery into the fabric of the case. The tire tracks, the forced lock, the powdery residue, all pointed to a hidden trail, one that led from the atelier to this forgotten shed. As she walked back towards St. Mary Mead, the mist lifting to reveal the village's familiar rooftops, Miss Marple considered the implications. The shed's proximity to Rose Cottage suggested it was no random hiding place. Someone had chosen it deliberately, perhaps to conceal evidence, or even Celeste herself. The silk scrap linked to Elise, the argument Clara overheard, and now the trunk in the shed formed a pattern that was growing clearer, though its final shape remained obscured. She thought of a village scandal where a stolen necklace had been hidden in a barn, its discovery unraveling a web of deceit. This trunk, she felt, was a similar key, waiting to be turned. Reaching the village, Miss Marple stopped at the post office to telephone Inspector Harrow, her voice calm but firm as she described the shed and its contents. "I thought it best to mention it," she said, her tone deferential. "It may be nothing, but one never knows." The inspector, accustomed to her suggestions, promised to send a constable at once, though his tone held a trace of skepticism. Miss Marple smiled to herself, knowing that her finds often proved more significant than they seemed. Back at Danamed Cottage, she settled into her armchair, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The shed was a new thread in the tapestry, one that tied the atelier's clues, the overturned chair, the smudge, the silk scrap, to a broader scheme. Elise's envy, Clara's fear, Isabella's secret letters, and Lord Ashford's late-night visit were all part of the design, but the trunk suggested a plan executed with care, perhaps desperation. Had Elise, driven by her rivalry, taken Celeste to secure her sketches? Or was another hand at work, using the shed as a temporary vault? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her thoughts as precise as her stitches. The powdery residue hinted at foul play, but without the trunk's contents she could only speculate. She recalled a village mystery where a hidden letter had revealed a blackmailer's plot, and wondered if the trunk held similar secrets. For now, she would wait for the inspector's findings, content to let the pattern emerge in its own time. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as common as the blackberries in her basket, Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a well-crafted gown, would reveal itself when the final seam was sewn. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The village of St. Mary Mead, bathed in the golden light of a late summer evening, seemed to hold its breath as the mystery of Madame Celeste's disappearance deepened. The annual summer fete, held on the green with its fluttering bunting and cheerful stalls, was a perfect backdrop for Miss Jane Marple's next move. She had orchestrated a subtle trap, one woven with the delicate precision of her knitting, to test the reactions of those entangled in the case. The silk scrap, the trunk in the shed, and Clara's revelation about Elise Dubois' argument with Celeste had tightened the threads of suspicion around the rival designer. Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, knew that a carefully placed word could unravel even the most guarded secret. The fete was in full swing, with children darting between games of hoopla and villagers sampling homemade lemonade. Miss Marple, dressed in her familiar tweed and a straw hat, adorned with a single rose, moved through the crowd with her usual unobtrusive grace. Her basket, ostensibly filled with raffle tickets, held her knitting, a quiet reminder of her ability to stitch together clues. She had arranged to meet Mrs. Bantry near the cake stall, knowing that the vicar's wife's penchant for gossip would amplify any remark she chose to let slip. Clara Wren was there, helping with the flower arrangements, her face still pale, but her movements steadier. Isabella Voss, radiant in a cream dress that shimmered with Celeste's signature elegance, posed for photographs, her smile as polished as ever. Elise Dubois, in a striking emerald gown, mingled with the gentry, her charm masking the bitterness Miss Marple had glimpsed at the auction. As Miss Marple approached the cake stall, she paused to admire a display of roses, her eyes scanning the crowd. Elise was speaking with the local squire, her laughter bright, but her posture tense, as if she sensed the weight of unseen eyes. Miss Marple joined Mrs. Bantry, who was nibbling a scone with evident delight. "Jane, you must try these," Mrs. Bantry said, her eyes sparkling with the joy of the fete. "But tell me, any news about poor Celeste? The village is positively buzzing." Miss Marple smiled, her tone light but calculated. "It's a puzzling case," she said, loud enough to carry to nearby ears. "I was at the atelier yesterday, you know, with Constable Reed. Such a curious thing, a scrap of silk caught in the window frame, emerald and gold, quite unlike Celeste's fabrics. And then there's that shed in the woods with a locked trunk. I do wonder what it holds. Sketches, perhaps, or something more telling." She paused, her eyes flicking to Elise, who had turned slightly, her conversation faltering. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Emerald and gold? Why, that sounds like Madame Dubois' scarf from the exhibition. And a trunk? Jane, you don't think—" She trailed off, her imagination already racing, but Miss Marple's attention was on Elise. The rival designer's face had paled, her hand tightening on her glass of lemonade. For a moment their eyes met, and Miss Marple saw a flash of panic, quickly masked by a forced smile. Elise excused herself from the squire and moved toward the tea tent, her steps hurried. Miss Marple's trap had been set, and the reaction was as telling as she had hoped. She continued chatting with Mrs. Bantry, keeping her tone casual, but her mind was alert, threading Elise's response into the pattern of the case. The silk scrap, the trunk, and now Elise's unease suggested a woman whose confidence was fraying. Miss Marple recalled a village gossip who had crumbled under the weight of a single pointed remark, her guilt exposed by her haste to flee. Elise, she felt certain, was hiding something, and the fete provided the perfect stage to draw it out. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple sought out Clara, who was arranging roses with a care that bordered on obsession. "Clara, my dear," she said, her voice warm, "you've done wonders with these flowers, but you look troubled. Is there anything you'd like to share? Sometimes a burden shared is a burden halved." Her eyes, gentle but piercing, held Clara's, inviting trust. Clara's hands trembled, a petal falling from the rose she held. "Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing around to ensure they were alone, "I should have told you before. It was Elise. She came to me after the argument with Celeste. She said if I didn't help her get Celeste's sketches, she'd ruin my career. She knew people, in London, she said, who could make sure I'd never work again." Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch as light as a breeze. There, she said, "you did right to tell me. Did you give her the sketches?" Her tone was soothing, but her mind was sharp, piecing together Clara's fear with Elise's boldness at the auction. Clara shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, I couldn't. I told her I wouldn't, but she was so angry. I think she did something to Celeste." The confession hung between them, a fragile thread that Miss Marple handled with care. She recalled a village girl who had been coerced into silence by a threat, her fear keeping a theft hidden until a gentle word unlocked the truth. "You've been very brave," Miss Marple said, her eyes warm with encouragement. "Leave this to me and try not to worry. The truth has a way of coming out." She squeezed Clara's hand, noting the relief in her expression, though the fear lingered like a shadow. As Clara returned to her roses, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Elise. The rival designer's panic at the mention of the silk scrap and the trunk, combined with Clara's confession, pointed to a desperate plan, one that had perhaps gone beyond theft to something far graver. Miss Marple moved through the fete, her presence as unassuming as ever. But her mind was a whirl of connections. The silk scrap, the trunk's powdery residue, the argument Clara overheard, and now Elise's threats formed a pattern that was nearly complete. She thought of a village scandal where a blackmailer's note had led to a confrontation, the truth emerging when fear overcame caution. Elise, she felt certain, was on the verge of such a moment, her gambit at the auction a bold but risky move. As the fete drew to a close, with the sun dipping below the horizon and the crowd thinning, Miss Marple lingered near the tea tent, watching Elise depart. The designer's steps were brisk, her emerald gown catching the fading light, but her posture spoke of unease. Miss Marple's trap had worked. planting a seed of doubt that would, she hoped, prompt Elise to act rashly, revealing more than she intended. Returning to Ganymede Cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly. The fête had been more than a village celebration. It had been a stage for human nature to reveal itself. Elise's panic, Clara's confession, and the lingering questions about Isabella and Lord Ashford were all threads in the tapestry of Celeste's disappearance. The trunk in the shed with its locked secrets was the key, and Miss Marple felt certain that its contents would unravel the mystery. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets bloomed like the roses at the fête, the truth was close, waiting for her gentle hand to draw it into the light. Chapter 11. The Unraveling. The quiet of St. Mary Mead, with its soft morning light filtering through lace curtains and the distant chime of the church bell, belied the undercurrent of tension that had gripped the village since Madame Celeste's disappearance. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cosy sitting room at Ganymede Cottage, felt the threads of the mystery drawing tighter, each clue a stitch in a pattern that was now almost complete. The silk scrap, the locked trunk in the shed, Clara's confession about Elise's threats, and the rival designer's panicked reaction at the fête had woven a tapestry of suspicion that pointed firmly to Elise Dubois. Yet Miss Marple knew that suspicion alone was not enough. The truth required evidence, and she trusted Inspector Harrow's diligence to uncover it. Her trap at the fête had been a calculated move, designed to unsettle Elise and prompt a misstep. The mention of the silk scrap and the trunk had struck a nerve, and Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unravelling village intrigues, told her that the rival designer's composure was fraying. She had informed Inspector Harrow of the shed's contents, and the inspector, though initially sceptical of her meddling, had promised a thorough search. As she sipped her morning tea, her knitting needles idle for once, Miss Marple awaited news, confident that the hidden trail she had uncovered would lead to Celeste. The telephone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the stillness. It was Mrs. Bantry, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Jane, you'll never believe it," she exclaimed. "The police have searched Elise Dubois' cottage. Inspector Harrow himself went this morning. They found something extraordinary, but he wouldn't tell me what. You mustn't know more. You always do." Miss Marple smiled, her calm demeanour masking the quickening of her pulse. "Dear me, how intriguing," she said. "I'm sure the inspector will share what's needed in time. Perhaps I'll call at the station later to offer my sympathies for their hard work." She hung up with a polite farewell, her mind already racing. The search of Elise's cottage was the next stitch in the pattern, and she resolved to visit the police station, under the guise of delivering a batch of scones, to glean what she could. The station, a small brick building near the village green, was a hive of activity when Miss Marple arrived. Constables bustled about, their faces taut with purpose, and Inspector Harrow, a sturdy man with a penchant for order, greeted her with a mix of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, accepting the scones with a nod, "your tip about the shed was helpful, I'll grant you. We've made progress, but I must ask you to leave the rest to us." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Of course, Inspector," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I only thought to bring a little comfort. Have you found anything of note? The village is so anxious about poor Madame Celeste. Her tone was deferential, but her question was precise, designed to draw out the truth without seeming to pry. Harrow hesitated, then relented, his professional reserve softened by her disarming manner. "We searched Madame Dubois' cottage this morning," he said, lowering his voice. "Found a hidden cellar, locked tight. Inside was Madame Celeste, alive, thank heavens, but shaken. She'd been kept there since the night she vanished. And in that shed you mentioned, we found her sketches, bundled in that trunk, along with a bottle of chloroform. It's a clear case now, but we're still gathering evidence." Miss Marple's face registered surprise, though inwardly she felt a quiet satisfaction. "Dear me," she said, "how dreadful for Celeste. And Madame Dubois, I presume, is in custody." Her question was innocent, but her mind was threading together the final pieces. The silk scrap, the powdery residue, Clara's fear, and Elise's panic at the fete. Harrow nodded, his expression grim. "She's not talking yet, but the evidence is damning. The silk scrap you found matches her scarf, and we've got Clara Wren's statement about the threats. Seems Elise planned to steal Celeste's collection and pass it off as her own at the gala. Kidnapped her to buy time, locked her in the cellar, and hid the sketches in the shed to copy them later." Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She recalled the gown at the auction, its uncanny resemblance to Celeste's style, and Elise's smug demeanour, now revealed as the bravado of a desperate woman. "Such a pity," she said, her voice soft. "Envy can drive even the cleverest to folly. I do hope Madame Celeste is recovering." "She's at the hospital being looked after," Harrow said. "She's weak but unharmed. Says Elise lured her to the cottage with a pretext about a business deal, then used chloroform to subdue her. Celeste woke up in the cellar, with no idea how long she'd been there." He shook his head, clearly relieved but still processing the audacity of the crime. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've done splendidly, Inspector," she said. "I'll not keep you from your work. Do give my regards to Madame Celeste when you see her." She left the station, her basket lighter without the scones, but her mind was alight with the clarity of the unravelled mystery. Elise's plan had been bold, but flawed, her envy leading her to a reckless act that could not withstand scrutiny. The silk scrap, the trunk and Clara's confession, had been the threads that unravelled her scheme, much like a poorly sewn seam splitting under strain. As she walked back to Danemed Cottage, the village green alive with the chatter of fete-goers still basking in the previous day's merriment, Miss Marple reflected on the case. Elise's envy had driven her to kidnap Celeste, hoping to steal her collection and reclaim her place in the fashion world. Clara's fear had kept her silent, but her courage in confessing had been the turning point. Isabella's secret letters, though a distraction, had hinted at Elise's broader influence, while Lord Ashford's late-night visit, though suspicious, proved incidental, a business matter, not a crime. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The case was solved, but not without cost. Elise's ambition had led to her downfall, a reminder of the destructive power of envy. Miss Marple thought of a village scandal where a jealous rival had sabotaged a neighbour's garden, only to be undone by a single misplaced tool. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as common as the roses in her garden, the truth always found its way to the light, guided by a gentle hand and a keen eye. Chapter 12. The Gala's Triumph. The autumn air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp promise of change, as if the village itself exhaled a sigh of relief with the resolution of Madame Celeste's disappearance. The mystery, unravelled by Miss Jane Marple's keen insight and the diligent work of Inspector Harrow, had restored a semblance of calm to the cobbled lanes and rose-laden gardens. Yet the ripples of the affair lingered, and all eyes now turned to the London Fashion Gala, where Celeste's collection was set to debut. Miss Marple, seated in her familiar armchair at Danemid Cottage, her knitting needles clicking with their usual rhythm, felt a quiet satisfaction. The truth had emerged as it always did, like a well-stitched gown revealing its elegance when turned right side out. Madame Celeste, recovered from her ordeal in Elise Dubois' cellar, had returned to her atelier with a renewed vigour. The sketches retrieved from the shed, untouched by Elise's schemes, were transformed into garments of breathtaking beauty. The village buzzed with pride, for Celeste had become something of a local heroine, her triumph over adversity a tale to be recounted over tea and scones. Miss Marple, invited to the gala as a gesture of gratitude, declined with her characteristic modesty, preferring to hear of its success through Mrs. Bantry's vivid letters. But she followed the preparations with interest, knowing that the human dramas woven into the case would find their final expression on the London stage. The gala, held in a grand hall adorned with crystal chandeliers and velvet drapes, was a spectacle of light and colour. Celeste's collection, a symphony of silks and satins, dazzled the audience, each gown a testament to her unyielding vision. Isabella Voss, resplendent in the sapphire taffeta gown that had hung unfinished in the atelier, moved down the runway with a grace that belied her earlier doubts. Miss Marple, reading Mrs. Bantry's account, noted the model's transformation. Chastened by the revelation of Elise's plot, Isabella had recommitted to Celeste, her ambition tempered by newfound loyalty. The secret letters, it turned out, were indeed from a rival designer, but Isabella's refusal to betray Celeste had redeemed her in Miss Marple's eyes, much like a village girl who had once resisted temptation to preserve a friendship. Clara Wren, too, found her place in the triumph. Her delicate embroidery adorned the collection's finest pieces, earning praise from critics who marvelled at the intricate details. Freed from the fear that had shadowed her, Clara worked with a confidence that Miss Marple found heartening. She recalled Clara's trembling confession at the fête, her fear of Elise's threats, and saw in her recovery the resilience of youth. Like a village seamstress who had overcome a bullying employer, Clara had emerged stronger. Her loyalty to Celeste a thread that held fast under strain. Lord Ashford, however, was a quieter presence in the aftermath. His financial support had ensured the gala's success, but his absence from the event spoke volumes. Mrs. Bantry's letter hinted at a withdrawal of his patronage, perhaps prompted by the scrutiny his late-night visit to the atelier had attracted. Miss Marple, reflecting on his guarded demeanour at the manor, suspected he had sensed the village's watchful eyes, much like a local squire who had once retreated from a scandal to avoid further gossip. His role, though not criminal, had been a shadow in the case, a reminder that wealth could obscure as much as it revealed. Elise Dubois, now in custody, awaited trial, her envy and ambition laid bare. The silk scrap, the chloroform in the shed, and the stolen sketches had woven a net from which she could not escape. Miss Marple, reading of her arrest in the local paper, felt a pang of pity. Envy, she knew, was a poison that could corrupt even the most talented, and Elise's fall was a cautionary tale, not unlike that of a village spinster who had sabotaged a rival's roses only to lose her own garden's bloom. As she sat in her cottage, the fire crackling softly, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the clues that had unravelled the mystery. The overturned chair, the smudge on the sill, the pearl button, and the silk scrap that had pointed to Elise. Each had been a thread, small but vital, in a tapestry that revealed human nature's complexities. She thought of the many mysteries she had solved in Saint. Mary Mead, from stolen silver to missing curates, and saw in Celeste's case the same patterns of motive and misstep. The gala's triumph was not just Celeste's, but a victory for truth, stitched together by patience and observation. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, the pale blue shawl nearly complete. The village was quiet now, its secrets settled, at least for a time. She rose to tend her roses, their petals fading with the season, and felt a quiet contentment. In St. Mary Mead, where human nature unfolded like the seasons, the truth was never far from the surface, waiting for a gentle hand to draw it forth as she clipped a wilted bloom. Miss Marple smiled, knowing that the next mystery, like the next stitch, would come in its own time, ready to be unravelled with her unerring skill.